Thank you so much. I want to say thank you first and foremost to Ethical Society for having me. Thank you all of you who are interested in the talk. I'm really honored to be speaking with you today. And I would like to share my experience in my own research and what I've found to be the link between animal rights and human rights. And so, like the name of the talk is Animal Rights, Human Security, and Global Sustainability. And I hope, well, one of the things I most love about everyone at the Ethical Society is that you are always open, you are always trying to stay connected to everybody and the world. And I feel like this is the perfect audience for this talk. And so I'm really, really excited to get started. I'll give you a quick background. My career has been in music, but I have become more and more involved in animal rights, and especially because initially I was singing mostly and you know, researching and performing about human rights causes. And the more I dug into human rights causes, the more I realized that there's a very strong link between human rights and animal rights. They're not separate, even though we often see them as separate. Does that make sense? We often see them as separate, but they're very much intertwined. And so the thing about that intersection is that very often it doesn't get the attention it needs. It's not really present. It's not really as apparent as it should be. So I hope that I can, through this talk, help bring you closer to this and help, you know, open some room for conversation. So the first thing I'd like to discuss is actually speciesism. Has anyone heard of speciesism? I know there's a chat, and I think you can post things in the chat, so feel free to do so. I'll be able to see that if you do chat. Speciesism, for those of you who don't know, is literally discrimination against a living being based on its species. So it's similar to racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination in that except that the discriminated against is a different species. And it has a lot of parallels to racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination in that there's the us versus them mentality. There's the in or out group mentality, that otherizing that can be very, very dangerous, which is very much the premise for a lot of, you know, oppression is, well, you are not part of my group, and therefore I'm not going to afford you the same consideration I would afford members of my own group. It's also, I believe, through my research, because I did a master's at the University of Pennsylvania in exactly this. My thesis was animal rights, human security, and global sustainability. And from my own research, I found that, and I believe personally that speciesism is the first form of discrimination we learn. You know, as children, we're taught to love our dog and pet our cat, but we're also taught to eat the chicken and eat the cow, eat the burger, you know, have eggs, have milk, and you know, but we would never ever consider milking our dog or eating our cat. And why is that? Well, speciesism is part of it. It's to say we've decided who is lovable and who is not, but we've constructed that. We can have this kind of, you know, outrage at the Yulin dog meat festival in China. But in reality, what's the difference in the ways that matter between a dog and a cow or a pig and a chicken? If you really, really think about it, the difference itself is only our perception. It's that we've been conditioned and socialized to eat cows and pigs and chickens and not at all cats or dogs. We'd be outraged. And we've normalized the exploitation of animals, of non-human animals, but we find that there are a lot of parallels in human exploitation as well. But if we come back, so I hope everyone gets a bit of an idea of speciesism. It's discrimination based on the species. You know, you're not from my species, so I can exploit you, I can harm you. I'm not going to afford you the same consideration I would afford my own species. I may know you feel pain, I may know that you're a sentient living being that wants to live, but you're not from my species, therefore I will harm you. Mustafa says, when was the term coined? It was, well, it was popularized by Peter Singer, but it was coined much longer time before that. But it really only popped up in literature, I think in the 1980s by Peter Singer, when he kind of revamped the term. So what are the ways that we exploit animals? Well, the biggest one is food, right? Food, we have leather, clothing, experimentation, and entertainment. But definitely the biggest one is food. That's where we kill and exploit the most amount of animals. Sanjay says, I have heard of it, and I am a speciesist because I hold our species to a higher standard than other species on this planet. So this is interesting because we'll get into why we feel that we are superior, and does that justify us then exploiting others? Okay, so this was exactly my next point. Why do we believe it's okay to exploit animals? I'm going to give you just 30 seconds. Think about it. Why do we believe it's okay to exploit them, to kill them for food, to wear their skin for leather, to experiment, to use for entertainment? So, well, if you think about it, many people will say intelligence, right? That they don't have the same intelligence as us humans. Well, I'll show you that intelligence is not actually our measure of what we will and won't eat. So, for example, animal intelligence is actually very much downplayed. We've downplayed it in order to justify the things that we do, because it would be much harder to justify if we knew the depth of animal intelligence and sentience. So let's take pigs, for example. Pigs are as intelligent as a 3-year-old, okay? But we wouldn't eat a 3-year-old. Pigs are more intelligent than dogs, just to give you an example. But we wouldn't eat, if they're as intelligent as a 3-year-old, why wouldn't we eat a 3-year-old? Just as an example. We wouldn't, because we just wouldn't. Also, but then what if we said, okay, how about a fetus? A fetus doesn't have yet what we would consider intelligence, but we wouldn't eat a fetus. Okay, what about somebody who's born with mental disabilities? We also wouldn't eat them. So intelligence is not really a factor of, it's not the measure for which we decide what we will or we won't eat. But also, you know, cows, they have their own communities, they form friendships, they're very much social animals. They can recognize all of their herd. They also have friends and enemies. They hold grudges. They choose leaders based on specific qualities that even we would want as humans to have leaders. And so, and fish are also quite intelligent. We've downplayed it, but you know, the point is that intelligence is not actually the measure. Neither is sentience, because we do. Another part of saying, okay, but then maybe they can't reason. Well, but we can't say that they don't have intelligence. They certainly do. Chickens, for example, can perform time travel, basic arithmetics. They can manipulate each other by Machiavellian means. They're a lot more complex than we would expect. They have certain calls for certain individuals in their community. So they form communities just like us. And another reason we would consider it's okay to exploit animals is the belief, you know, is sentience. We'd say, well, maybe we don't really know that they can feel pain. Well, science has proven otherwise. We know 100%. It's been proven that animals can feel pain. They can also mourn. They can mourn their loved ones when they die. They are capable of much more complex emotions than we expect. And furthermore, we don't have any proof that animals don't feel pain in the same way that we do. You know what I mean? But what animals may not have is, for example, moral agency. So a tiger will not be thinking, oh, maybe I could spare this animal's life and go have a salad, for example, or have some tofu instead of meat. But we do have moral agency. And so that's where we can be responsible. We can rethink our exploitation of animals. We can rethink our killing of animals. So intelligence and sentience, you know, we've downplayed them in order to justify what we do to animals. But just to give you an idea, can anyone think of examples throughout history of practices that were considered normal in their time, but now we see them as unjust, as inhumane, as unacceptable, and even illegal? Slavery, exactly. That is a big one. So, and there are many examples throughout history of practices that were normalized. They were considered fine because it was so prevalent. But the fact that a view is widespread doesn't make it right. So we do need to consider our actions that do have consequences. So yeah, medical experiments without permission. In fact, some of those medical experiments were done live, vivisection on slaves. So, and we do that now to animals. We do experiment live. For example, castrate pigs without any, and cows without bulls without any anesthesia. There's a lot of inflicting of suffering, and you know, this is something that for humans was considered okay, but for animals now is considered still okay. So to give you an idea of the scope of how large this is, factory farms account for 99.9% of chickens, 97% of egg-laying hens, 99% of turkeys, 95% of pigs, 78% of cows. So this is when we go to a supermarket, 99% of the time you're buying from a factory farm. But I'm going to use factory farm because it's so prevalent, and that's really the majority of where Americans do get their animal products. But I want to give you an idea of what animals endure in these factory farms. They endure constant fear and torment. They're given so little space that many of them can't turn around or even lie down comfortably. Egg-laying hens are kept in such small cages. Actually, they are kept in a cage about this big. Not even, like, this is as much room, even when it's free range. This is about as much room as a chicken will get to move. So in A4 paper. Chickens and pigs are kept in jam-packed sheds, and cows are kept on crowded, filthy, unhygienic feedlots. To give you an idea, 80% of all antibiotics used in the US go to farm animals, not to humans. This is shocking, but it's used to make them grow faster and keep them alive in unsanitary conditions where disease would be so widespread if they weren't taking antibiotics. And in fact, in a study that was done, 10 out of 22 slaughterhouse workers tested positive for antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So when we're now dealing with coronavirus, the next, I just read an article this morning, a doctor was saying that this was a dress rehearsal. The next bigger one is coming from factory farms, and we're going to be even more underprepared. So we have to bear in mind, when we give such large amounts of antibiotics to farm animals, eventually bacteria pops up that is not antibiotic resistant, and then we have a problem. We have superbugs. Most factory farms animals are genetically manipulated to grow larger or to produce more milk or eggs than they naturally would. For example, a hen would normally produce about 33 eggs a year in nature, but in a factory farm, we're talking about over 300 a year. But some chickens grow so unnaturally large because they've been genetically manipulated that their legs can't support their outsized bodies, and they suffer from starvation, dehydration, and can't walk to reach their food or water. And then at the end of this, when they're large enough to be taken to the slaughterhouses, they're transported on trucks for miles through extreme weather, doesn't matter how cold or hot, typically without food or water. And eventually in the slaughterhouse, they have their throats slit, often while they're still conscious. We'd like to believe that they're not conscious, but it's quite common that you find that animals have not really been rendered completely unconscious before they are skinned or hacked apart. There's many examples of animals still being conscious while this happens, because we have industrialized the process of killing animals so much to the point where it's not actually possible to make sure that everybody is unconscious, that each one of them is unconscious when they're killed. But when we talk about what about milk and eggs? Well, typically a dairy cow would live 25 to 30 years, but her body is exploited so much in the dairy industry that she actually becomes what you call spent, meaning she can't produce any more milk after 5 years, and ends up in the slaughterhouse and usually becomes hamburger meat or filling, because the quality of the meat is not as high as cows that are grown specifically for their meat. But also, a dairy cow endures tremendous suffering. So in order to produce milk, cows have to be either pregnant or have just given birth. So we need to keep them pregnant, or we need to keep them pregnant and giving birth in order to take their milk. So cows are forcefully impregnated. We would love to think that there's some romance in how a cow gets pregnant, but not at all. A cow is impregnated forcefully by a human by hand, and inseminated that way. If, we can use the word forceful impregnation, but it would be a very different word that we would use if it was done to a human female. And that is my point. We do things to animals that we would really not consider, or we would really be outraged if it was done to humans, even though in the past we may have done that to humans. After a dairy cow gives birth, we take her milk, we also take her baby. And a cow is pregnant for 9 months, same as humans. We take her baby, and if it's a female cow, she is given the same fate as her mother and enters the same cycle. If it is a calf, if it's a male calf, he's either left to die or grown for veal. Chickens are very often debeaked, and when we have male chicks, because they're of no use to the chicken industry, and especially the egg industry, they are put baby male chicks, and you can look this up. This is standard practice. This is not a one-off factory farm. This is standard practice. Baby male chicks are put into macerators and ground up alive. But if you don't like that, there's also some options of putting them in plastic bags to suffocate to death. So there is a lot of suffering involved. And we know that animals can feel pain. So if we know that animals can feel pain, what justification do we have to inflict that upon them if we know that they can suffer? And there's a famous quote that says, it's by Jeremy Bentham. It says, "The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?" And that is the question that I pose to you. In terms of numbers, we globally kill between 60 and 90 billion land animals a year. And that's just land animals. The US is responsible for about 10 billion. a year. And if we talk about sea animals, they're actually measured in weight because the amount is so big. So it's about 2.7 trillion tons of sea animals, and that includes bycatch, including turtles, sharks, dolphins, all the animals that we don't eat. But we have marketing terms to make us feel more compassionate. We have, you know, I don't know if you ever heard of the term compassionate exploitation, but we have marketing terms to make us feel better about exploiting animals. You know, free range, like I mentioned, is one of them. Free range only means that their chickens are not in cages, but they are certainly most often than not in a concrete large, we're talking tens of thousands of chickens in a large area. All free range means is there's going to be somewhere there, probably in a corner, a tiny window which leads to not grass or a field, which leads to a bit of concrete outside, so that if they could reach it, they could be outside on concrete. It's a tiny, like not even significant. And most chickens, because they're packed so condensedly, they do not actually, they never make it outside. Only the ones that are very, very close to that, but even then they're on concrete, and but most of the chickens in that don't actually make it outside. They never leave. Organic only means the feed that they're given. It doesn't mean anything else. So they're fed organic, but the conditions under which they're treated are the same. And the truth is, at the end of the day, all of their fates are the same, whether they are, you know, on a family-run farm or a factory farm. They all end up in the slaughterhouse. And so the label humane is very questionable, for me at least. When we look at humane, I mean, I'll pose to you, is there a humane way to take a life of a sentient living being that does not want to die? I don't believe there is. I believe there are better conditions. I don't justify them, but meaning that there are levels of conditions under which the animals can live, whether that's being on a, you know, being outside, outdoors, or being in a concrete building. But the truth is they end up slaughtered equally. So would it matter if I was nice to you your whole life before I shot you in the head? Yes, it would be better, but the best thing would be not to do it at all, right? So that's kind of where the humane thing comes in. But if we look at agriculture and climate change, animal agriculture and climate change, we're now living through the largest mass extinction in 65 million years. And the only mass extinction ever induced by a species, us, humans. Animal agriculture is the biggest culprit in species extinction, ocean dead zones, pollution of water, desertification, and destruction of habitats. It's also the culprit in the destruction of over 90% of the Amazon rainforest, and also accounts for about, well, the United Nations says 14.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions, but that's the lowest estimate. Another estimate is World Watch estimated at 51%. So if we think about that, we realize there's also effects on the planet and on our fellow humans, and our you know, our direct link to climate change. If we look at just water resources, it takes for 1 kilogram of cereal grain, we need 1,000 liters of water. But for 1 kilogram of beef, we need 43,000 liters of water. In order to produce 1 gallon of milk, we need 1,000 gallons of water. So we can see that animal products are also not the most efficient when it comes to use of land and use of water. But also livestock overgrazing, which is where, you know, livestock will eat will graze all of the land, is the leading cause of the world's desertification, which is 1/3 of the planet is already desertified. And that is already impacting about 1.5 billion people in the world, mainly in the global south. We might not feel it here, but there are people who feel it in the global south. And these people living in those conditions are already climate refugees, some of them, but there will definitely be an increase in climate refugees, but they're not protected under law. When we look at the human impact of consuming, or when we look at the human impact that our animal agriculture has, we'll know that we produce more than enough crops to feed the world, to feed everyone and end world hunger. I cannot stress this enough. This is something ethically for me, I really, it's so, so powerful to know this. We produce enough food to feed the whole world and end world hunger. We can feed 11 billion people right now with the crops we grow. That's more than the world's population. But in reality, most of the world's industrially produced grain goes to feed feedlots for livestock, instead of feeding the 1 billion hungry in the world. If we were to grow those crops to feed humans, if we were to grow these same crops to feed humans instead of feeding animals, we would be able to feed everyone. Lastly, you know, there are very real consequences of animal agriculture, including here in the United States. So when I talk about such high volume of animals, we'll note animal consumption and exploitation. The US is a leader in that. We kill 10 billion land animals a year. But the US has many problems associated with that. One of them is environmental racism. Has anyone heard of environmental racism? So let me break it down. All of these factory farms, they're not situated in wealthy, nice neighborhoods. They are situated in neighborhoods in areas of low socioeconomic populations, minorities, and people of color predominantly. And there is so much waste coming out of those factory farms that in order for them to keep functioning, they actually store the manure in what you would call open air lagoons. Huge, you can Google this and you will see huge amounts of lagoons, massive lagoons full of manure, urine, blood coming out of the factory farms. And there's a very bad stench, but also in order to circumvent laws or requirements that would mean that they have too much in their lagoons, they actually spray that manure onto the fields nearby, onto the lands. And so in reality, the neighbors and the communities that live in those areas, which again are people of color, people who are experiencing marginalization, predominantly minorities, they suffer the consequences. And one of those consequences is, you know, a lot of health problems: bronchitis, inflammation of the lungs, asthma, dizziness, eye problems, kidney problems, nervous system disorders, a fatal baby blues syndrome from elevated levels of nitrate in the water, salmonella, E. coli, and 40 other diseases that can be transferred from animal waste to humans. Now, we don't see this happening in Rittenhouse Square. This is happening, or in central Manhattan. This is happening in areas where people don't have the option to move to other neighborhoods. Slaughterhouse workers that are often refugees, undocumented workers, immigrants, people with little to no education that don't have the option to get other jobs, end up enduring the consequences of our animal consumption. So if I told everyone here, I'm sure of it, if I told everyone here that, okay, in order for you to eat your own meat, you have to kill the animal yourself, how many here would be okay with that? Okay, maybe a few people, but when you come down to it, I bet you would hesitate at least. if you had to do that. But most people would actually consider going vegetarian, at least, instead of killing an animal. So it can make us uncomfortable. So what do we do instead? We pay someone to kill the animals for us. But slaughterhouse workers have some of the highest rates of PTSD, substance abuse, elevated crime rates, and not to mention the physical problems such as ligaments that are torn from overuse, unsanitary conditions. They are not allowed bathroom breaks because they have to keep going on the processing lines. Often you might have heard some slaughterhouse workers, if they take a break, they're fired. So they've actually had to, some of them, wear diapers to work. These are the conditions that people are working in order to provide our animal products. So we have to consider for them, what are the conditions that we are paying someone else to work in? And does that justify our food choices? I mentioned world hunger, I mentioned climate change, I mentioned that we need a livable planet. We've depleted most of the ocean's fisheries, 3/4 of them, and we have over 400 dead zones in the ocean, but we may see even fishless oceans, not seas, oceans, by 2048, which is literally around the corner. It's our children, our grandchildren, who may not ever see sea turtles or other fish that we have seen and taken for granted. But the last thing I will mention is the effect that the normalization of violence has on our human psyche. When we have a culture of violence, can we really expect that it stays within those behavioral patterns? Can we expect that it's not going to be mirrored into our own societies? If we've normalized violence towards animals, it can trickle into our own societies, and we do normalize violence against humans, and we are living through that right now, as many of you know. Can we be surprised? Can we be surprised by the rape culture in our country when we are literally forcefully inseminating cows and taking away their children? There are consequences to normalizing that. Can we be surprised that we are seeing children and mothers being separated at US detention centers at the border, when we separate mothers, cows from their baby calves, and we've normalized that? So my 2 cents here is that this does trickle into our own society, and it does have an effect in our human psyche, and the normalization of violence towards animals ends up also contributing to the normalization of violence towards humans. And with that, I will open up for questions.
Okay, if folks would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. You can do that by going to the participants tab, and I believe on the right-hand side, it'll say raise hand. If you're on a phone call, I believe you can hit *9 so that we can recognize you. So if somebody, looks like Arnold. Go ahead, Arnold.
I think the answer to why we do that is because we can.
Yes.
I think life spurs every species on, and if a species just happens to be lucky enough to be able to dominate its environment, it goes on to do that. And I said lucky enough, I really should have said unlucky enough, because nature deals with species that dominate their environment. They ultimately crash. Look at what's going on right now. So I think the answer is because for some who knows reason, we're able to dominate our environment, and that's what life spurs you on to do.
Okay, so that's a really important point. You said we do this because we can. And I agree with you. We do this because we can, and we can with impunity. It is completely socially acceptable. It is completely normalized. And that is actually part of the problem, at least in my view. We as humans, we can evolve beyond violence. We can evolve to higher standards, and we have evolved to higher standards. You know, we have an elevated consciousness that allows us to have moral agency over other animals, that cannot question whether or not they can eat or harm another species. But we do not have to eat animals or animal products to survive. This is something that many doctors have spoken up on. In fact, there's many studies that show that animal products actually harm us. And I would invite you to look into them. I didn't mention the human health aspects only because I was focusing more on the ethical side. But you know, animal products can be very detrimental to health, to human health as well. And we have the capability to evolve, to hold ourselves to higher standards, to say that just because something's been done a certain way doesn't mean that we should continue doing it. If something, if we can evolve away from it, for example, we do not need animal products to survive, then we are at a moral standpoint where we can keep justifying something because it's the way things have been done, which, as we know from many practices in history, is problematic. Or we can evolve forward and say, I don't want to engage in violence towards, you know, I don't want to engage in violence towards animals or, you know, non-human animals or humans. And I can hold myself to that standard. And one thing I love about the Ethical Society members is you always, you know, you always question, how can I be better? How can I do better? So yes, thank you for this.
Linda Richardson, you have your hand up. I'll unmute you.
Hi, I was struck by the correlation between an intersection of racism and speciesism, and an example was the woman in Central Park who, while calling the police on an African-American bird watcher, was also trying to strangle and choke her dog.
Right.
I wonder if you have ever had a look at the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad's book, How to Eat to Live, who practiced the most of the ways in which people should live right by not eating meat and pork in particular. And his point was pork was given to African Americans as a cheap meal to keep us enslaved, but also has now created the comorbidity that's prevalent among those of us who are now suffering the worst of the pandemic. So can you do a little bit of an intersection of that?
Absolutely. Actually, you know, there's so many things implicated in everything you said, and I'd love that you asked that question. Yes, so you're right. Elijah Muhammad did promote a vegetarian diet. In fact, early Muslims, I found out, I didn't know. I was a carnivore growing up. I was not a vegetarian, and I certainly wasn't a vegan as I am now. It's been 10 years since I ate an animal, since I ate flesh, and it's also been 7 years since I've had any animal products. And veganism literally has changed my life. What I will say is that I think even here in Philadelphia, we have a mosque that is completely vegetarian. I wish it was vegan, but it's completely vegetarian. But there are a lot of, you know, there's a lot of, Angela Davis actually writes a lot about this. She's a vegan herself, and she will talk about the parallels of racism and animal exploitation. We know, for example, that also the sexualization of meat and there's a lot involved in the psyche of exploiting animals. In fact, if we think about this, this is, you know, if I'll read something that Peter Singer said. If we simply think that being a member of the species Homo sapiens justifies us in giving more weight to the interests of members of our own species, then we give to members of other species. Okay, so if we can prioritize, you know, members of our species over others, then what are we to say to the racists or sexists who make the same claim on behalf of their race or sex? There's a lot of research involved in this, and I have done this. In fact, if we look at some, I've done a study. The National School Lunch Program is problematic because 75% of African Americans are intolerant to lactose, to dairy. And yet it is one of the biggest things that are fed to children in our school lunch program. And I've studied the effects that it has on children, and their inflammation markers are very high. And it's not just African Americans, Hispanics as well, Arabs as well. There's many different groups as well, but in particular, I know that 75% of African Americans are intolerant to lactose and to dairy. And so how are we then feeding our children and these products in their school? And some of these children, that is maybe their only source of, their only meal or their only source of nutrition for that day. So if we are putting inflammatory products into their bodies, I think that should be challenged because it is a form of racism in my own opinion.
Okay, we have unfortunately time for one more question. So Doris, you are next.
I would just like your observations about some societies where hunting is integral, like the Inuit, Native Americans, and maybe even going beyond human societies that were essentially hunter-gatherer societies. Look at the animal kingdom where big fish eat little fish and cats eat mice, and like how does the natural system of hunting fit into speciesism?
That's a very interesting point. Thank you for that question. So I will say again, when we look at behaviors in the animal kingdom, in the non-human animals, we cannot, I don't feel that we can then justify our behavior because there's a lot that we don't do. We have cell phones, we live in homes, in concrete buildings, we've evolved beyond our primitive behaviors. We don't sniff each other's bums as a way to say hi, as other animals would. You know, there's a lot that we've evolved away from or don't practice that animals do. We don't eat our cubs if they're threatened. You know, there's a lot that we don't engage in terms of animal behavior, or that we have evolved from. But what I will also say is, you know, there are societies where hunting is their way of food. Not everybody lives near a supermarket. These are, you know, for me, issues that are kind of, you know, they're present, they're there, but I will not justify that being there as a way for me to then, you know, I have the option, you probably have the option, everyone here has the option of going to the supermarket and choosing, will we have beans and legumes or tofu, or will we have flesh? Will we drink almond milk or soy or oats or rice or hemp or hazelnut milk, or will we have cow secretions? You know, we have that choice. And if we know that we can live perfectly in great health, in fact, in possibly, I believe, better health, without animal products and without exploiting animals and without engaging in that violence, then why wouldn't we, is my question.